بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم.
Salam, hello, bonjour, peace to you all. Welcome to my show. This is Adnan Hussein, professor of medieval Mediterranean and Islamicate world history, and also co-host of Guerrilla History. Back for another episode. There was a recent episode on Twitter that I took note of and some very interesting discussions, and I thought it might be useful for people to have a deeper dive into the controversy that seems to have emerged around Thomas Piketty's latest intervention in the world of economics in the public sphere. And I found it a very interesting kind of responses that at least left Twitter or left X, if such a thing exists, managed to mobilize around it with a lot of different kinds of responses. But here to talk about, political economy and this particular study that was co-authored with Gaston Nieves, I'm not sure how to pronounce the other co-author's name. I've invited on a first-time guest, somebody who I'm really excited to be speaking with, Dr. Ingrid Kvangraven, who is a political economist and is senior lecturer in international development in the School of Global Affairs at King's College London, and whose research broadly centers on questions of uneven development, international financial subordination, and decolonizing economics. And I understand that's a new book that has come out on decolonial economics or decolonizing economics. And so I'm really delighted to welcome you onto the show, Ingrid. Thank you for making time to speak with me about this topic.
Thank you so much for the invitation.
Well, I'm looking forward to this because you had some very interesting remarks and comments to make, and given your study and background, you're perfectly positioned to provide some counter-analysis and critique of this paper, the title of which I guess I should tell people about. I don't seem to have it totally handy. Here it is, Unequal Exchange and North-South Relations, Evidence from Global Trade Flows and the World Balance of Payments, 1800 to 2025. And, this recent study has been framed by some respondents and certainly by its authors as an innovative new set of conclusions based on a hitherto untapped archive of historical data that's publicly available. And so I wanted to ask you first your reactions to this study, then the way it's being characterized. What's really new? Maybe it's always a good question to ask, and since we're dealing with a celebrity star mainstream economist who seems to have specialized in packaging forms of left political economy, Marxist political economy, in some ways it seems to be palatable to at least the mainstream audience today. I would also wonder why it's being so hailed, in certain quarters, if perhaps some of the conclusions, like saying colonialism caused unequal development and wealth disparity, that's not a new conclusion. What's going on here? Why is it being hailed? And maybe you can just tell us what you think is useful about it and the discussion that it has started.
Yeah, thank you so much. Someone who studies, uneven development, colonialism, imperialism, it's always interesting to see what comes out of the mainstream on these topics. So I went into this paper in quite a lot of depth. There's some things that are new, especially for the economics discipline, but a lot of this stuff won't be new for, Marxists and political economists outside of the economics discipline. But generally, what's genuinely new for, I think, in general, and that would be helpful for a lot of scholars who use data in their work is that they do construct this new open source database that they call the World Historical Balance of Payments database. That's open for everyone to go on and play around with. And it covers, what's new about it is that it covers a time period that's much longer. It collects data from different sources to cover 1800 to 2025. So this is innovative, and it covers geographically, it covers almost 90% of the world. So there's like a lot of countries there. And it includes historical and contemporary data on current accounts, trade balances, foreign income and foreign transfers, net foreign wealth, and what they call exorbitant privilege. So I think that in itself is a good service to the community. But then they have this mainstream economics framework that we can talk more about for understanding trade and growth and global transfers, to pose very simple questions about whether imbalances exist or whether the market corrects imbalances, right? And then they show that the colonial transfers between 1800 and 1914 helped to prop up the British Empire and other European countries that were running persistent trade deficits. And then they show that the US today is the main country with a persistent deficit, but that it isn't receiving these kinds of transfers. And they argue that this is one of the reasons why the US trade deficit is such a big problem for Trump and others in the US. And then they towards the end, they argue that foreign income flowing to the north is much smaller in scale now than in the past, and that financial transfers are mostly now flowing from the north to the south via remittances. So we don't have this problem of colonial transfers anymore. So for some context, they're speaking to a very conservative discipline. So the questions that might seem obvious to us aren't as obvious for economists, because they're coming from this world where, in conditions of what they see as perfect markets, you would have exchange rates and price mechanisms adjusting trade balances so that we wouldn't see persistent imbalances. So this is like a key assumption in mainstream economics that dates all the way back to David Ricardo, but it's in every single economics textbook. So for economists, this is a relevant question, even though for us it might not be that interesting. And of course, Marxists have always challenged this assumption, and Marx himself challenged this assumption. So what Nievas and Piketty do is they identify and measure the global imbalances, and then explain them by pointing to what they see as kind of non-market or non-economic factors like colonialism. So this is to some extent useful in the economics discipline because it challenged this idea that Britain or European countries developed based on internal factors, right? Endogenous processes, innovation, technological development. This Eurocentric assumption is challenged by their view, even though, of course, they don't put it in those words. And also it challenges the assumption that trade balances over the long term. So I can talk through a little bit more about the empirical findings, and then we can kind of break them down and see what the problem is. So the main thing is the current account. That's like the headline kind of finding that they talk about, which for non-economists is basically the net trade balance in goods, net trade balance in services, net foreign income flows, and net foreign transfer inflows. So the headline finding is that core European powers, which include Britain, France, Germany, and the Netherlands, these 4 European countries, had a permanent current account surplus between 1800 and 1914, while the rest of the world had significant deficits. So already we have this, persistent surplus and deficits that goes against the idea of this balancing happening. And then since the 70s, the main surpluses come from oil countries in the Middle East and North Africa and East Asia, which is mostly driven by Japan and China. And the only world region with a similarly large imbalance is the US-driven, like they call the region North America and Oceania, but they say, this is basically US-driven. So we can refer to it as the US, which has an annual current account deficit close to 1% of world GDP. On average in 1990 to 2025. So these big headline figures, changes in the global economy. And the whole paper is about unpacking the different elements of the current account for these different regions in that period in order to say something about the changing North-South relations. So, their findings reflect part of the story, but not the full story, as I guess we'll get into. And the contradiction or puzzle that they pose after they have this headline figure is that Europe was in a persistent goods trade deficit. It had a trade deficit in goods in that same period, 1800 and 1914, and that deficit was even larger than the US trade deficit today. And this was mostly, they imported a lot of primary commodities, so this is where the deficit comes from. They were also exporting a lot of manufactured goods, but the amount they were exporting didn't make up for the sort of deficit in primary commodities, right? And they then say, because Europe was the manufacturing powerhouse of the world at that time. And then they draw a parallel, which we can talk about and problematize, between Europe then and East Asia now. And they say that East Asia now is the manufacturing powerhouse of the world because their manufacturing surplus, is comparable to the one that Europe had. So basically, they're suggesting that East Asia now occupies this global position that Europe had in the colonial period. Although with the big difference is that East Asia doesn't have a deficit the way that Europe had. So then they ask, okay, so how was the trade deficit possible, given that they had the current account surplus? Where's the surplus coming from? And then they say, okay, so current account consists of net trade balance in goods, where there's a deficit, net trade balance in services, net foreign income, and net foreign transfers, as I mentioned. And they basically find that in those three latter, there's a surplus on those accounts. So they had a surplus in services, but most significantly, they had an enormous foreign income inflows that were equivalent to about 300% of its 1914 GDP. And that no country or region in the world has ever received foreign income inflows approaching the magnitude that Britain and the core European countries received in that period. They do look at the foreign income inflows received by East Asia, Europe, and North America in the contemporary period and find that they're very, very small in comparison. And they also find that Europe received these significant foreign transfers that were mostly colonial transfers, like either one-off tributes, and they have the example of, for example, the debt imposed by France on Haiti, or more importantly and significantly in magnitude, the public and private transfers from the colonies to the colonizers. And the really big ones here are India to Britain or Indonesia to the Netherlands. And they find that, in recent decades, net foreign transfers don't flow from the south to the north anymore. They flow from the north to the south because of aid, but also mostly the biggest driver is the private remittances that migrants send back to the global south. And then they look at foreign wealth and find that the net foreign wealth held by European powers amounted to about 34% of world GDP in 1914. So this is huge. And the amount of wealth, net foreign wealth that Britain held was 17% of world GDP at that time. So crazy, crazy amounts of foreign wealth. And this, if you look at what's happening today and those figures today, in East Asia, the net foreign wealth that they have is about 11% of world GDP. And for Middle East and North Africa, it's about 4%. So it's very, very small in comparison. And what they then argue is that this discrepancy that was there in the colonial period isn't there anymore. Foreign wealth accumulation actually looks a lot more like what you would see described in an economics textbook today. Countries that are able to accumulate this kind of wealth also have a trade surplus, right? So these things correspond. And you see that with the US as well, because they have very, very large foreign debt. But this is roughly in line with their trade deficit in that period from the 70s to 2025. And then finally, the final empirical thing that they look at is what they call exorbitant privilege. And they see that the countries that control the dominant currency, leading financial institutions, so UK in the colonial period and US now, are able to borrow at lower rates and obtain higher returns on their foreign investment compared to other countries. So this is what they call the exorbitant privilege. And they find that North America does gain from this privilege in that period. and they measure that gain, which is quite interesting. And they find that it's about like what they earn from this privilege is about 29% of the GDP in the 1970 to 2025 period, and that other regions lose out because they don't have this privilege, but still those amounts aren't enough to actually reverse the trade patterns they observe. So what they conclude then, based on all of these empirical findings, is that under the British Empire, a Britain-led Europe was able to appropriate sufficiently large transfers and income flows from the rest of the world so that they could transform their trade deficits into large current account surpluses and accumulate huge amounts of foreign wealth. But in the 1970 to 2025 period, so the contemporary period, the US, although it's able to appropriate some gains because of its dominance in the financial system, this hasn't compensated for their trade deficit. So they argue that this can explain some of what they call nervousness and aggressivity from Trump vis-a-vis the rest of the world. And they basically suggest that Trump would like the kind of financial transfers that the UK had in the colonial period as a kind of compensation for its leadership in the global stage, but that the rest of the world isn't willing to give this to the US, and that's where the kind of conflict comes from. Yeah.
Yeah, okay, so interesting. So there's a contrast between this colonial era period, 1800 to 1914, and then another period that is principally described by what we would think of perhaps as neoliberalization, they call maybe globalization, during the 1970s into the contemporary period. As a historian, I have to say, well, what about 1914 to 1970? I mean, how do they explain, the state of the global economy during that period? Obviously, I think, the World War II and decolonization has some big consequences. How do they factor those in their story? Are they, significant moments at all?
That's a good question because it's hard to know what exactly they're thinking. I mean, what they present is the empirical data.
Right.
And they talk about colonial transfers and they talk about changes in the trade balance. But they don't use terms like, well, they have the first era of globalization and the second era is like what after colonialism ended. So in that sense, I think that there's an underlying assumption that imperialism ends with colonialism. So therefore, you have a situation that looks more like the economics textbook, even though there's still power imbalances. There are kind of legacies of the colonial period. So there's this suggestion that manufacturing, U.S. kind of developed as a manufacturing power to some extent, and you see that in the graphs that they present. But it was kind of quickly then, after a few decades, taken over by East Asia, which is now the powerhouse. And this is how kind of globalization has allowed manufacturing and production to operate at a global scale, and in a way that actually leads to much less divergence in terms of the global wealth or differences between countries. They look at GDP total, like they don't look at GDP per capita, which always makes China look much bigger. So when you see the graphs, they're like huge. The wealth that the Britain and the Europe had was really immense in the colonial period, and the differences are like smaller in the second period of globalization. So they don't they don't theorize this explicitly, but I think that when you look at the data and look at what they're writing, it seems like there is this underlying assumption that things are becoming more equal.
Okay, interesting. I mean, this maybe is another way of asking essentially what did, that seems to be the story that they're telling, and that it fits in with some idea of, idea of the world system as working to equalize. So even though they're pointing out that there are these particular periods where there's been unequal exchange and development that could or should be rebalanced or is a problem, there is this other period in between that seems to be more equalizing. And I'm wondering, what non-mainstream political economists would say about this story of unequal development. They're also trying to use empirical methods, but they're interpreting them perhaps in different ways. I don't know how much the specific set of data that this study of Piketty and Nieves is built on, how it changes the picture, whether this kind of data was completely inaccessible, and whether that changed the way in which some other non-mainstream economists, would have framed these things. But what's sort of the counter story, that has come to some similar conclusions, but maybe has a very different picture also of this period from the end of formal colonialism and the kind of second wave, as they're characterizing it, of either neoliberalization or second phase or second period of globalization. What are some of those kind of counter views and counter narratives?
Yeah, so there's a huge Marxist literature on this, on uneven development in the global south and north, and that the idea that there's a connection between development and underdevelopment, and that we can't understand the dominance of the capitalist center today, historically and today, Europe and the US, without also understanding exploitation and extraction in the global south historically and also today. So in this story, it's like colonial transfers is a part of it, and there are some Marxists that have, documented, Marxists and non-Marxists, that have documented parts of these colonial transfers. Like most famously, Utsa and Patnaik have documented the transfers between India and Britain. But the key argument is that colonial transfers can be seen as a reflection of an imperialist system, but that it can't explain actually the uneven system. You have to start with the development of capitalism, which starts before the period in question, that actually led the European countries to become dominant, to industrialize, and become these manufacturing powerhouses, which was supported by first income from the transatlantic slave trade, and then also later from colonial transfers and foreign income. But that these transfers are important, but what led capitalism, the emergence of capitalism, was about a change in social relations, which doesn't come out in the story from Nieves and Piketty. So that's a crucial insight from the Marxist literature. Although the transfers would be important, and change in commodity prices are important, which Nieves and Piketty also talk about, there's also the element of competition. There'll always be competition in global capitalism, and this will lead to hierarchy, unevenness, subordination, and colonialism then and imperialism today has to be understood in that context. That capitalist powers act to secure capital accumulation for their capital, their companies, and colonialism and imperialism can't be understood as something that's outside or separate from capitalism. So this literature is completely erased in Nieves and Piketty's paper. And when they published their piece last week, there was a huge amount of outcry on X, rightly so, because they do use the term unequal exchange in the title, but they don't actually cite any of the scholars who have done work on this, which is very typical of mainstream economists. So I don't know if we can necessarily blame Nieves and Piketty as individuals. This is like a systemic trend within economics. And of course, a lot of people criticized Piketty when he published his first book, Capital in the 21st Century, without having read Marxist Capital, right? So there's a lot of debate on unequal exchange in the Marxist literature, dating back to Enrique Emanuel and Samira Amin, who were debating these issues in the 70s. And they were both trained economists, by the way. But in the mainstream, since they're Marxists, they're not considered economists. And there's also a lot of contemporary work on this by, for example, Jason Hickel, who argue that there are these like huge value transfers flowing from the south to the north. And this has continued after the end of formal colonialism. And Nieves and Piketty do cite some scholars who have tried to estimate this, like they cite Lenin, Hobson, Hilferding, Nauroji, and the Patnaiks, which is already, I was quite surprised to see these Marxists cited, but they're only cited as scholars who have worked on trying to estimate the transfers, not to actually mention their theories of capitalism. So I think that is maybe like one of the more serious problems for me. Not the lack of citation, of course, is problematic, but this kind of depoliticization of something that could be considered a Marxist term. So because in the Marxist framework, unequal exchange is about trying to understand value transfers across the globe. And there's a lot of debate about how to do this, but there is kind of a value theory underpinning it. It isn't just about income transfers. So making unequal exchange about trade balances, commodity prices, and financial transfers and income primarily, like by doing this, Nieves and Piketty are taking a Marxist term and filling it with non-Marxist content, which is kind of what Piketty did with his book Capital as well, where he took the name of Marxist capital and then proceeded to treat capital as wealth rather than a social relation.
That's very interesting. I mean, there's so much more to talk about in this vein. And, I noticed you just cited Jason, Hickel's work. And I did notice that he seemed to be trying to take in response to the Piketty Nieves article, himself trying to take a somewhat positive approach to emphasizing the good conclusion that colonialism had caused unequal exchange, and that period had created in many ways the world that we've inherited. And so I think he was trying to maybe just emphasize that, because that's an important point that for some unknown reason, it's not so unknown, but for mainstream economic thinking has been typically excluded. And so to have this mainstream economist who has a lot of influence articulating a point that is very significant and important historically, it seemed like he wanted to really emphasize that this is a positive, and so it's in that vein. Look, even Piketty is coming out and, understanding that without really taking into account colonialism, we won't understand the disparities that exist today, with the moral implication that something should be done for that unequal development, and that it isn't, as is so typically part of the development, modernization, westernization, globalization, discourses, that there's something, wrong with the global South for failing to, develop and become wealthier, etc. Right? So that is an important point. But I noticed that, you were less ready to kind of emphasize something that, can be credited, but it is in some sense so necessary and obvious, but that rather your sort of critique or criticism was focused around the problems of precisely not having that conceptual or theoretical framework for analysis that you mentioned, the empirical kinds of conclusions of the Patnaik's work in estimating what the financial transfers were. And I just have to say, and I really also do find it somewhat annoying that economists are talking about financial transfers when we could also say theft, exploitation, financial transfers were, it wasn't that somebody said, like, we're doing a bank transfer. Oh, well, why don't we just give you this money? This was stolen, was taken. It's primitive accumulation. So in any case, but that, they're willing to kind of take the, empirical work of trying to estimate that, but not the larger conceptual analysis around it. So why would it be important to really understand, that kind of a theoretical framework of analysis that establishes this history of unequal exchange caused through colonialism? And also, maybe one might say whether this leads to a different kind of conclusion or analysis about that second so-called era of globalization and the flaws in the understanding of the more current situation and why and how perhaps the simple analogies that are created from data around financial transfer, around really aren't sufficient to understand how the system is operating. Perhaps you could kind of tell us a little bit more about your critique and what you think is missing and what's at stake really in having that kind of theoretical and conceptual framework for analyzing the empirical data.
Great, thank you so much. I think that that's the really important question, which was what was really frustrating me, which is why I went and like trolled him on Twitter. But before I answer the stuff about theory, I just wanted to say something about the economics discipline and how, because there is this kind of split, I think, among critical scholars in terms of to what extent they celebrate these things in the mainstream or not. And I think the reason I find it so provocative and problematic when they do these things, and he's not the first economist to talk about colonialism, is that so we have this book Decolonizing Economics that just came out that I published with Devika Dutt, Carolina Alves, and Serbi Kazar, and we talk about how the economics discipline is Eurocentric. And a key part of our argument is that even when they deal with issues of race or colonialism or imperialism, they reproduce this Eurocentric framework. They have the Eurocentric framework based on neoclassical economics, which I'll talk about in a moment. And then they add on these things that sound radical, which makes it hard to have these arguments with mainstream economists, because they're like, but we do consider colonialism. There's Acemoglu, Johnson, and Robinson that just got the Nobel last year, the Nobel in economics. And they talk about, colonial legacies, which is true, but the way that they talk about it is Eurocentric. So it's really, really frustrating. And I think that Piketty and Nieves and Piketty also have this problem that they empirically estimate colonial transfers or, financial transfers, as you said. But they still end up with what I would say is still a Eurocentric view of capitalism, which is, the most important political problem. So that's why this is kind of provokes me so much. So to talk a bit about their theory. So they understand capitalism. I mean, it's not the way they understand capitalism isn't explicitly spelled out, and this is also very typical of economists in the mainstream today, because there's been a narrowing and there's not like big theoretical debates between different theoretical frameworks. Rather, there's debates within what we would call like late neoclassical, where economics is seen as a kind of rational system or something that can be rational, if there are imperfections are corrected, and they can be equal, it can be managed if it's managed well. And although Nieves and Piketty frame their intervention in a very theoretical way, you can kind of see these theoretical foundations when you dig into their assumptions and also the policy proposals. And this assumption of like a rational, equal capitalist system flies in the face of the Marxist literature on capitalism, which sees it as uneven, inherently uneven, prone to crisis. So it's not theoretically possible from a Marxist perspective to have an even or fair capitalism, as it's inherently, there's an inherent tendency to generate exploitation, hierarchy, subordination, and inequality. And there's also an astonishing lack of reflection in the paper around why the US has this exorbitant privilege that they talk about. And whereas like Marxists have done a lot of work to show how the development of the US as a hegemon happened along with the emergence of the US dollar as world money. So these are, closely connected, whereas they see it as something that's just about, borrowing cheaply on the market, and they don't historicize it or explain it from a political economy perspective. So that their suggestion then that the US is now at a moment of weakness, given its huge debt and trade deficit, while still having this exorbitant privilege, doesn't really hold up or isn't explained well. And I think that's because of this narrow methodology and understanding of capitalism. They're only able to grasp a very small part of the picture. And then another problem with the theory is that they see colonialism and imperialism as separate from capitalism, as I mentioned before. And this is in the economics literature, this assumption is often made that the economic is separate from the political. This is like a distinction that emerged with the marginal revolution in the early 1900s, which eventually led to the establishment of the economics discipline, and is very prevalent in the field. So it's, to be expected that they would see things this way. But then there's two problems with that in terms of this paper. The first is that colonialism is it's just seen as that there were transfers that came to the European core countries, rather than understanding that the British state at that time, starting from 1800s, which is when they have the data from, was a capitalist state, right? So it had emerged as a capitalist hegemon, and was compelled to appropriate value abroad as a part of the function of the capitalist state. So you can't just separate colonialism from that analysis. And the second problem is that in making this separation, they're making it seem like imperialism is over now, that colonialism is over, because the only unfair inequality they identify today is this exorbitant privilege of the US, which they measure in terms of how easily they can access cheap debt. So this is very narrow and methodologically nationalist understanding of capitalism, which is another kind of key aspect of a Eurocentric understanding of capitalism. They see states as and they analyze things at the level of the state. So they're unable then to see how the US is an imperial power because they only focus on the country's current account. They ignore the fact that since the 70s, there's been a new international division of labor that has allowed US corporations to make enormous profits via outsourcing manufacturing production to the global south, including to a large extent East Asia, and managing these complex systems of global value chains to support capital accumulation for American firms. So innovation then remains concentrated in the north to a large extent, and manufacturing in terms of assembly happens abroad. So when a Foxconn factory exports an iPhone to the US from China or India or Vietnam, this shows up as an import to the US, even though it's an Apple product and Apple's an American company. So a lot of scholars have, problematized this analysis of the trade balance in the past, and showed that a lot of production in China is structured in a way that supports US empire rather than actually challenging it. So that's completely missing in their analysis. And looking only at the trade deficit as a source of weakness, therefore kind of masks the US capitalist power. Even with Trump's, crazy policies, the US dollar as a form of world money has shown, remarkable resilience, which shows then that the US doesn't need this coercive colonial transfer as the British Empire did, because capitalism is organized in the way that allows US corporations to keep accumulating at a global scale. So this alternative understanding of capitalism, which a lot of the Marxist scholarship and other critical scholars put forward, contrasts very, very sharply with the assumptions in Nieves and in Piketty, where they suggest and also say explicitly in some instances that what drives development is transfers and investment in human capital at a national scale. But given that global value chains are structured in a hierarchical way, income transfers at a national scale or investing in human capital at a national scale won't challenge those hierarchies in capitalism. And then I also want to problematize this finding that I mentioned earlier on how, in their paper, they see East Asia as the manufacturing powerhouse now, right? On par with what Europe was in the 1860s to 1914. And I think given what I just said, it should be clear that this is a very narrow and misleading account of manufacturing supremacy, given that they don't mention that a lot of the manufacturing happening in East Asia is actually controlled by Western capital, while manufacturing in Europe was controlled by European capital, right? So this is completely lost in their methodological and theoretical account.
Yeah, that's fascinating. It's very valuable critiques for the difference between these different eras, these different structurings of capitalism. If you don't have a theoretical and I would say, a real historical materialist understanding, it's very easy to just sort of think of capitalism as just this sort of abstract set of, mechanisms, and not see that it manifests itself and organizes itself and economic life and production and inequality in different ways, at different periods in history. There's so much more to really get into, but one small kind of follow-up to that occurred to me is that it isn't really only, of course, Piketty and Nieves who and the kind of mainstream economists who kind of deny the relevance and significance of imperialism with capitalism, and think of them as, a historical, political kind of condition of a previous era in colonialism, in particular, that, post-World War II, that doesn't exist, and especially now, with like globalization, it is even less relevant because, just as you were saying, placing East Asian economies, because of the way in which they understand wealth flows and transfers and so on, in the same position as the manufacturing hub of the world, the way Europe was in that previous era, just kind of masks and does away with the idea that, instead it's like, well, see, they're the dominant economies, and this is part of the kind of sense of grievance that perhaps informs populist politics behind Trump's sort of rhetoric, is the idea that, well, we're the ones now who are being exploited by this strong China, this kind of thing. And I guess one thought that I had here is that it's not just them, really, and their mainstream colleagues, but there are even some Marxists who, have removed imperialism from their analysis and thinking about changes in the global economy. And even the example that you gave about Foxconn, I've heard used by David Harvey to say, well, look, really, imperialism is not operating, and that's an old kind of, process that is no longer relevant. This is a much more integrated kind of capitalist world order that, where imperialism isn't a useful rubric or frame of analysis, and it's not as relevant. I don't want to get you involved in some kind of polemic, of these sort of debates, but it's interesting that would be the case. And I think highlights how important the analysis you gave now, and I'm going to go read this book on decolonizing economics, because I think that is a crucial question or problem that, many, people even on the left are not politically recognizing and also considering that it would have importance in describing the current state of capitalism. I'm wondering if you had any other thoughts about that, how to make more visible that point and what's at stake in even Marxist orientations that have decided to kind of characterize the global economy as not being usefully described within the frame of imperialism today as a result of neoliberal integration and so on. They'll still say it's capitalism, but they'll say, well, but imperialism isn't really very important. And they're still apparently critical of capitalism, but the frame of where the critique would be is really pushed in a different direction if they don't make that recognition. So I'm wondering if you had any thoughts on that.
Yeah, great question. And something we discussed a lot also when we were writing the book. And we have a whole chapter on heterodox economics. Because
I love that term, by the way, I have to say. As somebody who is a medieval historian and kind of deals with sort of religious phenomena and movements, I love the recovery of heterodoxy here as a liberatory, kind of decolonizing move. So I think it's a great frame.
The argument that we make is that heterodox economics, including Marxist strands, in terms of their focus on social relations and power, it's a very good starting point for understanding capitalism and imperialism. But there are a lot of strands that don't go far enough. And as you said, there are Marxists that are Eurocentric. There are obviously other heterodox economists that are Eurocentric. Even though you would think that starting from this critique of political economy, starting from thinking about capitalism as a social relation, would lend itself very well to understanding questions of imperialism and uneven development. So there is, definitely a lot of debate about this and like dismissals around imperialism. And also, like when I was doing my PhD, I was interested in dependency theory, and I got a lot of pushback from Marxists and other critical scholars that were just thinking about it as outdated and not relevant. So I think it's very important to have these debates in the critical within the critical spheres and push for an understanding of imperialism or dependency today that isn't the same as obviously it's not the same as the colonial period. It's very different. And I think there are some like misunderstandings around that. And even if you start from like the social relation in capitalism, you can still, we still need to understand like, okay, so how does that then shape, states, capitalist states acting as empires today? And I find it hard to, like, if you're interested in the question of uneven development, I find it weird that even Marxists aren't trying to theorize how imperialism is different today than it was before. So yeah, I definitely think that you're right. It's not just a question of the mainstream. It's a question of critical left heterodox Marxists as well.
Yeah, and that's, I think, what you were saying before is that, taking into account colonialism itself is not enough if it doesn't transform the frameworks of analysis, and that they're still Eurocentric assumptions. I find this the same in history. The field has changed. History departments have changed, where it used to just be European and American history and maybe, kind of some little smattering of other world regions. Now, of course, there's a rebalancing in terms of, interest and methods and approaches to trying to think cross-regionally and so on. But very often it's just adding, new regions to the analysis. A lot of what is, shaped as world history is simple inclusion into a Eurocentric framework of analysis rather than a transformation of it. So I think there are probably a lot of analogies in different disciplines and fields of social and historical and economic and political analysis, that the story that you've told about how economics, fails to really change its kind of methods and approaches sufficiently to escape this, endemic Eurocentrism, could be told for other disciplines.
We call it the blind spots approach.
Right. Okay.
Just, cover a blind spot.
That's right.
Cover the blind spot.
Yeah, that makes sense. Just on that though, like maybe I would say that one criticism that I would have of this, thesis by Piketty and Nieves is also that the time horizon, and I think you alluded to this in your previous discussion, that by limiting it to 1800 forward, kind of takes a periodization that, and I'm not sure if there's just no data available, or if they thought it was too complex or scanty in terms of historical information to take into account and try and extend the period. But if you're really going to begin after industrialization, has already started taking place in a very profound sort of way, after all of these kinds of changes have started to happen, and that they're connected very deeply to European conquest and exploitation of vast territories around the world, in the Western Hemisphere, in Africa and Asia. That of course you're looking at a world that has already started to form itself and create a kind of economic system of those social relations that define capitalism are already there, which gives them a sense of being natural, a sense of their being kind of necessarily, and can't themselves be questioned and changed or altered. That's the frame from which all future analysis has to proceed. And so I would say that, widening or lengthening, to have a longer durée account of the formation and development of capitalism would expose, well, like the work of Gerald Horne does, or people like, Cedric Robinson, racial capitalism, thinking about how, and I would say we should even go beyond just thinking about the slave trade and the Atlantic, system, but also, of course, very importantly, what's happening in Asia, in the Indian Ocean, and also how this is, my own sense, and I think Michael Hudson might be doing the economic kind of side of this a bit more, is the way in which the kind of crusading society that's created in Latin Christendom in the later medieval period begins to establish some of the practices and paradigms and techniques that will be so useful in exploitation, conquest, trade, enslavement, that's combined also with a kind of religious and then therefore transformed into a racial kind of form of difference that can then be exported and refined and developed much more successfully in the Atlantic system, which is when we say modernity happened. But, looking at it in a longer period starts to reframe some of the questions. And so I'm wondering if this would be a critique that you might agree with, and how you would sort of talk about the limitations and the consequences of taking 1800 as the starting point for their analysis of these inequalities that emerge or, have already really been in some ways established, but then are exploited fully, in that period of so-called globalization in the long 19th century.
Great. That's a very good point. And I think that one of the reasons why they start there, well, probably the main reason why is because of their data. And they say that they want to get it, they want to develop the database to go further back. But this is obviously a work in progress. But they don't problematize that in terms of like their theoretical conclusions or anything. And I think that's because they see, like in the mainstream, generally in economics, the development of capitalism is just seen as like a quantitative increase in production, right? Rather than a qualitative shift. So as you were saying, and like, as we know, this qualitative shift happened before the 1800s, at least the beginning of it happened before. So, if we actually want to understand like the divergence, global divergence, and the foundations of this north-south divide, we have to look before that question. I think in their theoretical mind, that doesn't occur to them because that's they have a different view of capitalism, but it gives a misleading view of how capitalism evolved in Britain. Of course, the colonial transfers were important, but Britain, as I mentioned before, is already a capitalist state, a dominant capitalist state with dominant, corporations. So it was in a very strong position to take advantage of the rest of the world. And that there's no discussion about that in their paper. So if we start at 1800 and take the Nievas and Piketty view, we could end up with a conclusion that it was basically the colonial transfers that caused England and other and European countries to become dominant, which again, I think goes back to the separation of colonialism from capitalism. And it is in line with what we see in how the discipline has evolved, since there were like big debates in the 70s about how to understand the development of capitalism within the economics discipline, where there was a move away from trying to understand social relations to just trying to quantify things, with the whole rise of pleometrics and everything in economics. And there's a very good critique of this by a historian called Ronald Bailey from 1986. That's really good to show how like the neoclassical economists come in and they just focus on transfers, and how this actually completely doesn't allow you to actually see what led to the development of capitalism. So yeah, I think you're completely right. This is like the fact that they don't even talk about the lack of their explanation because of the starting in 1800 shows that they have a very different understanding of capitalism.
Right. And, I think maybe that is also what allows them to play these games once you've created and sort of absorbed the assumptions in the architecture of the system that they're describing. Then it makes it possible to, make these small adjustments and see, well, how would it have played out if we just change these factors because you're not looking at like the actual social relations that are structuring. You're only looking at financial data and kind of narrow and precise. They might be imprecise, to be honest, since they don't really capture what's really happening, but kind of specific forms of data that they can quantify and then just change the levels within. And so much of what they offer is a kind of, I find, really, really strange. I'm always very interested as a historian in counterfactual thinking and how this plays out to justify kinds of conclusions and perhaps even the recommendations, which I hope we'll get a chance to talk about in a minute. But these kind of counterfactuals as a sort of methodology. Well, if it had been this slightly other way and arbitrarily chosen, and we have no idea what the political conditions may have allowed for, is it just if only the wise people of the early 19th century had understood that if we just paid more for these commodities, that over the long run, we'd have a better world outcome. I mean, this has nothing to do with the calculations that anybody who is, making decisions about, how to make money in those time periods and how to govern the, territories they'd subordinated or conquered. So I just find that really strange. And so I'm wondering what you would say are some of the methodological problems and how this affects some of their conclusions. This kind of counterfactual thinking that produces, some sense of the malleability of the past had it been structured in the way that they envision capitalism operating.
It's such a great question, and it's so ridiculous. I mean, when you put it like that. But yeah, so yeah, this is a thing in the economics discipline that that economists now do. Like, you can't have a scientific conclusion, or your scientific conclusion would be strengthened if you have a counterfactual, because otherwise, what can you really say about anything if you don't have a counterfactual? It's kind of the assumption. So this is also why like randomized control trials are huge in economics, have become huge in the past decade or a little bit more, because then you can control for what would have happened if you didn't make that intervention. And economists working with historical data are then also trying to make these fake counterfactuals, which is just shows. I mean, it really exposes the weaknesses with the theory. So basically, in one simulation, they explore what would have happened without colonial transfers, assuming all else is equal, and argue that without this flow, South and Southeast Asia, and to a lesser extent Latin America, would actually own large assets in Europe rather than the opposite. In particular, India and Indonesia would own large parts of Britain and the Netherlands, which is just like playing around with numbers and makes no political sense at all.
And it's what everybody wanted to do back then. It's like let's like invest in some like distant, cold, countries far away that don't have many natural resources. Yes,
exactly, and that just would never have happened given the political economy of capitalism at that time. And then so they put those assumptions together with this assumption that commodity prices were 20% higher. So there's like, let's see what happens if commodity prices were 20% higher, and then they assume that the extra income that global South countries get from the commodity prices would be invested in human capital, and that the return to human capital would be around 10%, which is what they consider to be normal. And then they put that together with they remove the colonial transfers, and then they see, okay, what would have happened in this counterfactual world? And the result is, and this is one of the graphs that Piketty tweeted as well, where you see that there's almost convergence in the global economy. And they call this, like they say, had this happened, that we would have generated a quasi-complete productivity convergence between poor and rich countries over that period. Which is absurd, because then, this goes back to what I was saying earlier, that they're assuming that, human capital, investment in human capital is what drives economic development, right? And that colonial transfers is something that isn't a part of how capitalism was evolving at that time. It's, super, super problematic. And because we know, there's a lot of literature on this, and some of the work I'm doing right now is on looking at a British corporation in the colonial period and seeing actually, the reason why it went abroad in the late 1800s was because of the profitability crisis in Britain at that time. And there were a lot of, British corporations were going abroad, and the state was then coming to support those corporations, giving them legal cover, infrastructure, and those things. So it wasn't like, this is, again, it's the capitalism and colonialism division that they're, promoting that just doesn't make sense. You can't just separate the colonial transfers from what was actually happening at that time. So imagining this counterfactual where all else is equal except colonial transfers just doesn't make sense analytically. But this is, because they don't focus on the social relations, they only quantify, and therefore, they miss all of this rich historical background.
Well, how do you think this affects their conclusions? In essence, what they come up with as policy recommendations, because that's the whole point for them in some ways.
Yeah. So the policy conclusions flow quite naturally from the theory, in the sense that they're very limited, they're very narrow. They focus on transfers, taxation, trying to, like, they have one recommendations where they're like, oh, if only, the exchange rates were pegged, or you had a common currency. So they kind of, again, assume that it's possible to have an exchange rate where trade balances. Or they're saying, oh, maybe we could tax current account surpluses, or maybe we could provide cheaper credit to everyone, so that they, have the possibility of developing. And in a way, I mean, those things are not bad in and of themselves. Like access to cheaper credit probably is, something that a lot of countries in the global south would want. Taxation, fine. But it's very detached from any serious analysis of uneven development between the North and the South, I would say. It flows from their, rational understanding of capitalism. But if we take the view of political economy and capitalism, like we've discussed earlier, that comes from Marxist tradition, then these policy recommendations are really inadequate, because they kind of assume that fairer rules or minor adjustments can make capitalism even. Don't take into account that the institutions that evolve, that we have today, are a part of and a reflection of the power dynamics of capitalism. You can't negotiate your way to a more fair system. There's a reason why we don't have a common currency, as was proposed by Keynes. I mean, they mentioned the Bancor proposal by Keynes as a possible thing. But there's political reasons why we don't have that, and there's also political reason why we don't have a new international economic order, which I think would include some of the things that Nieves and Piketty propose in terms of reform of the international monetary system, international organizations. But really, the fact that we have the IMF, we have the World Bank, we have the US dollar as world money, it reflects power dynamics in the world. So it's also a bit, narrow and a bit naive to think that you can just make these adjustments without actually tackling the politics of it. So I think in many ways, the narrative, from the beginning to the end with the policy conclusions, supports this idea that, imperialism is not something that we have to deal with in a political way. Rather, we just have to focus on these minor adjustments to transfers between countries.
Right. I mean, it reduces it to some policy prescriptions that, of course, no one will probably really do in the those who control these economic art and political architecture of the globe and these institutions and so on. But it makes it seem as if there are some precise things that could be done. I would make it fairer without having to change anything very dramatic about the structure of economic and political life. I mean, so this is I can see it being a useful political project as well. In this kind of multipolar world, right, that's emerging, and we don't know the shape that it's going to take, but with, the fact that there is the BRICS and the BRICS Plus and some kind of expanding sense of organizing, counter approaches and counter institutions to those that were created after World War II, and the IMF and the World Bank and so on, that go back to 50 years really of problems. I mean, you referenced the new international economic order, which of course, was 51 or years ago. UNCTAD, basically global South countries had proposed some adjustments to the global economy and new different principles. And there was, quite interestingly, recently the Progressive International put together a number of very interesting essays and comments on the 50th anniversary of the new international economic order to try and repropose for our own time, given what's happened over the last 50 years, some of the best ideas or some of the possible new ideas, and to try and kind of take up that sort of effort. And so I'm wondering, in some sense, because the dollar as a reserve currency for trade in the world seems to be weakening in terms of its predominance. There are alternatives being talked about. There are political, but maybe not especially ideologically informed kind of efforts under BRICS. That how would you situate the Piketty and Nieves approach and this paper and the wide sort of circulation of it and the discussions that are coming out vis-a-vis changes that are taking place, that we don't know what exactly will happen, with them, but these proposals that they make on the basis of the kind of research and all the flaws that you've pointed out do seem to represent some kind of attempt to present a vision for a more fair world that wouldn't actually necessarily require dramatic change or rebalancing of power, partly by saying, well, look, Asia's already, really in the driver's seat here. All we really need to do is make some adjustments, have a currency, and so on. So I'm just wondering, like, politically speaking, how you see these recommendations functioning, in light of the changes that are taking place geopolitically and economically.
Yeah, great question. And yeah, it's so they definitely, I think there is a need for this kind of like, from the mainstream perspective, there's a need for this kind of intervention. And I think Piketty kind of filled that, like, a gap already with his book on inequality. And, it was a similar thing where I was like, oh, look at these huge, wealth inequalities that we have in the world, in the global north, is what it started with. That, because that was something a lot of people were talking about, and he empirically documented it, which was important. But then, of course, ended up with policy conclusions that were very reformist, and it was about taxation, basically. And I think this is kind of a similar thing where there's huge inequalities in the world that are impossible to ignore. And there's the rise of the BRICS. Some people are talking about a new international economic order, although I don't know how much of a challenge that really is perceived as, because I don't think it's not talked about at the scale that it was in the 70s. It's just a few countries and Progressive International. But I think in this context where there is like this feeling that there's, not just a feeling, there is a kind of clash between countries and between China arising as and being perceived as a challenge to the US. So in that sense, it places itself in the debate, the part of the debate where it's saying, well, actually, we don't need to. There don't need to be major changes. We can just, if only we just agree to change the prices of commodities by this much, or if only we just agreed to tax surplus countries, actually things could equalize and we could have what they call it productivity convergence. So there doesn't have to be this like conflict that we see. There doesn't have to be uneven development. We don't have to think about how the BRICS is challenging the US, because we can have a world where all the countries are equal and all the countries converge, which is this illusion of the possibility of even development. So I think that's another part of the reason why like when seeing studies like this, even though, you know, there is a kind of feeling that you want to celebrate that finally colonialism is being recognized as exploitative. I think that the role it plays politically is problematic, because actually it then serves to kind of legitimize a system that is highly unequal by just saying, oh, you know, we just need these kind of small reforms.
Yeah, I noticed that like it's not framed at all in the language of, say, reparations. You know, it's not, which is a real political demand. I mean, it's not framed.
Actually, very briefly in a part of the paper.
Yeah, I think, yeah, maybe a brief one, but it's certainly
Yeah.
not like a highlighted, you know, top of the line headline recommendation that, well, you know, there should be some measure of retributive and redistributive justice for, you know, past exploitation under colonialism. I mean, obviously, it's underlying a little bit this sense that, well, maybe we should, you know, try and get to a more, you know, even development by equalizing things with adjustments like taxes and so on. But I mean, I think maybe one of the points is, and that you're highlighting, is also the failed project of sovereign development. You know, this is the problem, is that the system never allowed for genuine sovereign development. And, you know, so, well, we can safely say that this is going to be it's a contribution to a discussion, you know, that has to be had. I think you've helped us see, you know, what it might contribute and what its larger limitations will be for those who actually care about a non-capitalist and equal future for, you know, for the world. But I really want to thank you so much for taking the time and educating viewers and listeners about you know, political economy and why you need to, you know, reincorporate the politics into the economics. It's been a really fruitful and useful discussion. And before you go, is there anything you've mentioned your work on, you know, decolonizing economics? And I'm wondering if you would like to tell listeners anything more about where they can keep up with your work. I mean, they should be following you on X, because that's exactly how I managed to come across some of your fascinating and barbed criticisms that have led us to have this wonderful and educational conversation. So where can people follow your work? And are there any things you'd like to highlight that people who are intrigued by the discussion and your analysis might want to go and actually read?
Good question. So I guess, yeah, X maybe. Blue Sky is also the place, you know, we're trying to kind of, yeah, shift over there, although it's not really working, but trying. Yeah, I guess that's where I am on social media. On my website, I put up whenever there's like new papers or books or whatever, then I put it there. I think they can buy the Decolonizing Economics book on the Polity Press website. It's only £15, so it's not too bad compared to, you know, other academic books. And hopefully it'll be on LibGen soon, but not yet. But yeah, so
great. What's the website? We'll put a link in the description, but maybe you can tell listeners what your website is.
ingridhk.com.
Okay, terrific. Thank you again so much. I really enjoyed this conversation and learning from you.
Thanks for having me. It's been really, really cool.
All right. Well, listeners, you know, keep tuning in for more discussions, you know, like this that we're having on this channel for public education. Of course, you can like, share, subscribe. This is a fairly new channel, unlike Guerrilla History, which is more well established. So do like, share, subscribe. And if you want to help support the channel and the video editing costs and so forth, you can always make a contribution at patreon.com/Adnan Hussein. But rest assured, we will always make our content free and publicly available, because that's the point, is for you to see it and to learn from it. So until next time, peace and solidarity.